In the last lesson, we looked at Sophocles' Antigone, a classic Greek tragedy, a work that speaks across the ages, but also a work that was produced in a particular moment, in a particular context, in 442 BC. And it's a warning to the Athenian democracy, as well as a response to the sophists. In their challenge to morality, the sophists said that we cannot know if the gods exist, and we cannot say that morality is truly objective. Man is the measure of all things, Protagoras says. But Sophocles responds in the Antigone by saying that traditional morality is true and just, that there is an objective law of God, a law of Zeus, that humans should obey. Sophocles is a defense of tradition. In other words, Sophocles grounds his account of justice in tradition. That is how he says that we can know what is truly just, through tradition and practical wisdom. But over the next several lessons, we'll see that for many philosophers, this was not enough. For several philosophers in classical Athens, it was not enough to say that morality is true simply because it is tradition. That is insufficient. That is not a rational, that is not a defensible account of what justice, what morality is. And we'll look in this lesson at the philosopher Plato. Plato is, in some ways, the fountainhead of all later Western philosophy. He is one of the 3 or 4 greatest philosophers in all of human history. He's the first truly systematic philosopher who thinks through morality, who thinks through epistemology, that is what knowledge is, who thinks through what nature is, metaphysics. And he thinks these through systematically in a way that would influence all later philosophers. Plato himself was the student of Socrates, an Athenian of the 5th century, who is in many ways the turning point of the philosophical tradition. In fact, it's symbolic that we call all philosophers before Socrates simply the pre-Socratics, because Socrates represents a turning point. With Socrates, philosophy turns away from scientific speculation and turns towards practical morality. With Socrates, philosophy comes to question traditional, everyday kinds of questions about the nature of the good life, the point of life. Socrates became quite a public figure in late 5th century classical democratic Athens. He was from the ordinary working classes, but he achieved great notoriety, maybe fame, through his public philosophy. Socrates achieved this notoriety through his philosophizing in the agora, the public spaces of democratic Athens. He was famous for questioning famous Athenians or sophists about their moral beliefs. Now, nobody likes to be questioned deeply, especially by a philosopher, about their moral beliefs. And Socrates would describe himself as a gadfly. That is, as something that would bite you and would bother you into thinking about the nature and grounding of your moral beliefs. And Socrates was a profound teacher. He never wrote anything so that we know his philosophy principally through the writings of his own students. And Socrates achieved this notoriety through his public questioning of prominent Athenians or sophists by pestering them, by asking them about the foundations of their personal moral beliefs. Now, individuals don't like to be pestered about their moral beliefs, especially by a philosopher. And they especially don't like to be questioned in public, in front of others, be made to give an account of what justifies their personal morality. But Socrates made a career of it. He was a profoundly moving teacher. And in the late 5th century, he gathered around him some of the sons of the elite Athenians who deeply admired and loved their teacher. In fact, Socrates wrote virtually nothing down in his whole lifetime, nothing of his philosophy. And we know his teachings only through the writings of his students, principally Xenophon and above all, Plato. Now, Socrates became a public figure. He was famous for questioning other Athenians. And eventually, this caused his unpopularity to rise to the level that would result in his death. It's fundamental to understand the thought of Plato, to understand the trauma of the death of Socrates and the effects that it would have on Plato. In 399, Socrates was charged with 3 counts, with corrupting the young, with introducing new gods and with not worshiping the state gods of the Athenians. And in the midst of democratic Athens, Socrates was brought to trial before a large jury of ordinary Athenians and held before the court on these three charges: corrupting the young, not worshiping the state gods, and introducing new gods. Two of them really religious charges. Socrates was prosecuted. Socrates defended himself, and a version of his defense speech famously survives in what's known as the Apology, that is the defense, self-defense of Socrates that was written by his student Plato. And Socrates defends his questioning, he defends his pursuit of truth and his pursuit of the moral life. Nevertheless, Socrates was truculent. He refused to give in to the Athenian pressure to change his ways or to apologize for his philosophy. And Socrates was condemned and sentenced to death. So in the midst of this democracy, we see an individual fundamentally committed to seeking the good life, condemned to execution for his beliefs. Now, in a particularly striking way, this calls out the contrast between democracy and liberalism. The Athenian democracy was democratic. It placed great power in the hands of the people. But it wasn't necessarily liberal. We would say that it doesn't necessarily recognize fundamental individual rights. Socrates is executed for his religious teachings. This is not a state where there's a fundamental or inviolable individual right to the free exercise of religion. It also evoked the dangers of democracy. And a man like Plato would watch his teacher, his beloved teacher Socrates, be put to death for his beliefs. That would forever undermine Plato's faith in democracy as a just constitution. And Plato's skepticism about democracy would reverberate throughout his philosophy and throughout his political ideas for the rest of his life.